Okay, hello everyone. This is Colin Cox for English 1010 here at Northeast State Community College, and this is the Week 14 audio lecture. So, what I want to do in this audio lecture, and I'll try to keep this brief, is just offer a summary, perhaps even a review of some of the important facets of writing a research essay, because at this point, you should have transitioned from perhaps the principal or the primary research part of this assignment to now actually doing the work of writing the essay, compiling everything, placing hopefully those final edits to your work over the next couple of weeks. And when I say I want to review some of the things that we've discussed in this unit, I'm specifically thinking about, and some of this will address concepts that we have discussed throughout the semester, but I'm thinking specifically of thesis statements, just reviewing what it means to have a thesis statement, ways of describing and defining a thesis statement. I also want to speak about signal phrases and in-text citations, works cited pages, all of that work that here specifically is necessary to successfully execute a research essay. And then I just want to say a little bit about actually responding to the researched material that you cite, those secondary sources, etc. So that's the plan, that's the goal for this short bit of audio. Again, I think this is important and essential, even though a lot of what I want to discuss here, I think we've probably discussed at least once, if not multiple times, throughout the semester, but specifically in this research essay unit. So let's begin with thesis statements. So one of the more challenging parts of understanding a thesis statement is the degree to which thesis statements often have a variety of different definitions. That is to say, even though a thesis statement is a particular thing, there's a variety of different ways to describe what a thesis is, and I would encourage you, and hopefully this class has allowed you to do this, have your own specific, unique, particular definition and understanding of what a thesis statement is. But in the simplest terms, a thesis statement is an argumentative assertion. It is the important, significant, overarching claim that your essay supports and develops. I've often thought of it this way: a thesis statement is the claim you stake. It is the point, it is the idea, it is the unique assertion that you introduce and then support and develop throughout your essay. And another great way to perhaps think about a thesis statement is to think about it in relation to what we might call a fact or a factual claim. Now, a fact unto itself, just a fact independent of anything else, is not a thesis statement, because a thesis statement is ideally something you would argue. So when thinking about, well, how can I check, how can I confirm that my thesis statement is in fact a thesis statement, ask yourself that simple question: is this something that someone could argue? Is this an argumentative assertion, or is this a factual claim? And if it's a factual claim, there's perhaps things you can and should do, ways you can change and modify that claim to make it more argumentative. So if you have a thesis statement, and if you think to yourself, well, there isn't a possible way that someone could disagree with or argue against this point, I think, as strange and even counterintuitive as it might sound, if someone could not disagree with what you think is your thesis, that's a sign of weakness as it relates to your thesis. You want your thesis to be something that would and can engage a reader. You would even want a thesis that someone could theoretically disagree with, someone could challenge you on, because what that reveals, what that indicates is, I actually have a thesis statement, I have an argumentative assertion. Now, having a weak thesis statement is obviously something you would want to avoid. Therefore, if you could envision ways that someone could disagree with your thesis, that might, in addition, be an indication that you need to do certain things to strengthen it. But here, if we're just thinking, well, I want to confirm that my thesis is in fact a thesis, maybe one of the first things, one of the best things you could ask yourself is, could I envision someone disagreeing with this? And if you could, that may be an indication that at the very least you have a thesis. That's not an indication necessarily that you have a strong thesis, but if that first step or that initial goal is just to ensure that your thesis is a thesis, that's a great thing to do. Imagine, could someone disagree with this? As it relates to having a strong thesis, I would also encourage you, and this is work you can and should do as you edit and refine your essay, ensure that all of the points you make, all of those smaller subsequent points that you make throughout your essay, ensure they actually do the work of supporting your thesis. The last thing you would want is some tangential point that's utterly unrelated to your thesis, because while that might be interesting, the goal of body paragraphs, the goal of the remainder of the essay itself, all of that in addition to or independent from your thesis, it should do the work of supporting and developing your thesis. A great way to think about it is to imagine, sure, it's great to have a strong, compelling, argumentative assertion, but that unto itself is not enough to have a persuasive thesis. That's what the remainder of the essay does. It makes that thesis statement, it makes that claim more persuasive. So always think to yourself as you develop and write those body paragraphs, is it doing the work? I hope it does the work of supporting my larger claim. And if it doesn't, if it's not, then perhaps you need to either remove any of those points that are unrelated to your thesis, or, and this is something that I see with students often, there's a way those points could be relatable to your thesis. You just need to do the work of clarifying to your reader how it's relatable to your thesis. So however you want to think about it. And again, I would empower you to have your own definition of what a thesis statement is. And it could just be a slight modification of some of the things that I've said or some of the things that I have mentioned in previous audio lectures. But yeah, leaving this class with a firm and confident understanding of what a thesis statement is something that I think is extremely important. So I would definitely spend a bit of time thinking about the thesis statement that you have for your research essay, ensuring that it is strong, argumentative, impactful, etc. And a few additional quick things. Don't neglect the question that you asked in your research essay benchmark assignment, because one of the things I've mentioned throughout this class, the importance of asking a question, knowing the question that you hope your essay answers and addresses. And please don't mishear me when I say this. I am not suggesting you actively need to ask a question in your essay. This is something that is best suited for you as the person writing this essay, something that you have in mind, a kind of guiding principle, or if it's multiple questions, a set of guiding principles. Because once you feel like you have an answer to that question, what you have at that point is a thesis statement. I would also encourage you, and I've left this comment on some of your previous essays, there's language or linguistic frameworks you can use to signal to your reader that you are about to deliver your thesis. Something as simple as, in this essay, I will argue. That is language you can actively use in your essay. So imagine you want to deliver your thesis statement at some point in your introduction, perhaps near the end of your introduction. How would you finish that sentence? In this essay, I will argue. Something else that might be useful, and the degree to which this is useful is certainly dependent on not just your topic, but also the way you want to approach your topic, using this while, however framework. So an example of this might sound something like, and I'm just using this as a hypothetical, while some people think that a universal healthcare system will not meaningfully address medical costs, I, however, will argue that it would for these reasons. So again, it depends on your topic, it depends on how you want to approach your topic, but this while, however framework can be extremely useful and quite clarifying when you're imagining delivering your thesis. So whether it's this in this essay, I will argue linguistic framework or this while, however framework. Feel free to use either of those because anything you can do to not only make your thesis as clear as possible to yourself, but maybe more importantly to your reader is something you should absolutely do. Now, with that said, let's transition to speaking about signal phrases in text citations. Don't forget, I provided a lot of information and material in the content tab, specifically the research essay module, and also don't neglect Yusha and those additional videos that I made and that I have made available over the last few weeks. In the simplest terms imaginable, a signal phrase is language you use to introduce borrowed material. It could sound something as simple as this: an author's name followed by a present tense verb. So, for example, Amanda Plummer writes. This is something that is extremely important when introducing borrowed material for a few different reasons. The primary reason, I would argue, is because it helps to enhance readability. If you just begin a sentence with a quote that feels confusing at times, it can feel disruptive, it interrupts perhaps the tone and the cadence of your essay, because one of the things that good writers do, especially when they write research essays, they find ways to introduce borrowed material that doesn't feel disruptive. That's one of the reasons why I've emphasized the importance of signal phrases so much. And also, don't forget, I provided that document in the research essay module identifying a myriad or variety of different verbs you could use, because if you just consistently use a verb like writes, that can feel repetitive. Again, that can disrupt the reading experience. So choosing different signal phrase verbs, having a few different signal phrase verbs that you like to use, introducing novelty, introducing difference is extremely important. Now, with the in-text citations, remember that is language that appears after your borrowed material in parentheses. If it's a single author, the author's last name and the page number. And again, I provided a lot of documentation, a lot of examples and resources. There are slightly different rules depending on what it is you borrow from. If, for example, it is a piece with multiple authors, you need to mention both of their last names. If it's a piece without an author, in that situation, because the first piece of information on the works cited page is the title of the piece in quotation marks, that's what you would use in your in-text citation. And as far as page numbers are concerned, if you have access to them, you should absolutely use them. If you are using, for example, information you find on the library databases, it's quite easy just to download those pieces, because at that point you'll have a PDF version of whether it's an essay or a chapter from a book or whatever. At that point, you will have access to those page numbers. If you don't have access to that, it's fine. You can simply exclude or omit page numbers because they simply don't exist. But I would still like you, if you know, for example, the author, if it's a single author, if it's multiple authors, I would still like you to use their names in the citation, because doing the work of practicing with these citations is one of the things this class hopes to teach you, and just, again, increasing your familiarity with this, having this feel less foreign and more native, I would argue is extremely important. Now, I also wanted to say something quickly about works cited pages. Remember, you need that full works cited page at the end of your essay. And when you move to submit the final draft of your research essay, just house all of this on the same document. So begin a new page, and at that point, have your works cited page. We use MLA documentation standards in this course. If you use information from the library databases, one of the benefits is The databases themselves, they actually provide a full citation at the end of each piece. There is a slight modification you need to make to the page numbers, but aside from that, everything looks good. If you are not using information that you find on the library databases, you need to create those citations for yourself. There's a lot of different ways to do this. I provided a few citation builders in the research essay module. But if you have any questions about your citations, specifically the full citations on the works cited page, don't hesitate to contact me. I would remind you, just alphabetize everything, so the first letter of the first word for each full citation, whether it's the author's last name, the title of the piece, that's how you would organize it. One of the things to avoid, hopefully you know this, I don't want to see just a list of URLs that does not meet or satisfy MLA documentation standards. I would also encourage you to use those full citations as a guide when thinking about how to create those in-text citations, because the full citation on your works cited page has a relationship with those parenthetical in-text citations that appear throughout your essay. If the first piece of information, and this is how you can and should use it as a guide, whatever the first piece of information is on the full citation, whether it's the author or authors' last names, the title of the piece because you do not know the author, etc., that's the language you should use in your in-text citation. Because if I were, for example, inclined to learn more about your sources, let us say I want to read one of your sources, the only way I would find it using the information within the essay itself, those in-text citations, I would take that information and use it to find the full citation. Therefore, if, for example, you do not know the author's name, and the first piece of information that should appear on the full citation on the works cited page is the title of the piece, if you instead use, for example, the online magazine or the website or whatever that published it, if you use that information, for example, let us imagine you want to cite something published in the New York Times, and for whatever reason, they do not attribute it to an author. If you just say New York Times instead of the title of the piece, I don't know where to go. So I always use, and this is true for anyone reading anything that uses MLA documentation standards, we use the information in the in-text citations to lead us to the full citation on the works cited page. So keep that in mind. And again, use that full citation on the works cited page as a guide. Whatever the first piece of information is, that's what you should use with your in-text citation. So now, let me say a little something about responding to borrowed material, because one of the things you want to avoid when incorporating borrowed material, in addition to not having signal phrases, not having in-text citations, you would want to avoid dropping the material you cite or the material you quote. What that means is you want to always have some kind of a response, whether that's analysis or an explanation of how the secondary material relates to, builds, and develops your thesis. You always want to have a response of some kind. The last thing you want to do is just quote from, for example, one of your sources and then transition to something else. Because, and here, just pause and think about it for a second. You are quoting from all of these sources as a way of developing your larger claim, which is to say your thesis. I don't know how you do that or how you want to do that. That's your job and your responsibility to explain to me how the secondary sources, that borrowed material, it's your responsibility to explain to me how it relates back to your thesis statement. So be sensitive to that, because how much you have, want, or should say in response to secondary sources, borrowed material, it depends, for example, on, there's a variety of different factors that might influence how much you want to say, should say, etc. But if, for example, it's early in your essay and you are simply clarifying important terms and concepts, you may not necessarily have so much to say, but at least make an attempt, because there are things that you can say, for example, to indicate to your reader that, hey, these are important concepts that I will return to later in the essay. If you are well past that point and you're working within those body paragraphs where you are actively and even forcefully doing the work of developing your thesis, at that point, hopefully you would have a fair amount to say in response to the secondary sources and the borrowed material that you cite. So again, you've heard me say this a lot, be sensitive to that. The thing I want to encourage everyone to avoid, obviously, I want to see you quote from, incorporate borrowed material, but engage with that borrowed material. Explain to your reader how it relates to your thesis. And if you find you are having difficulty doing this, it may indicate that whatever material you have incorporated, perhaps it's not as relatable to your thesis as you initially thought. And that might indicate that you have certain changes or modifications that you need to make. So, okay, I think I want to stop here. As always, if you have any questions, please email me. I'm happy to help in any way I can. But for now, this is Colin Cox here at Northeast State Community College for English 1010. Have a nice day, and I hope to talk to everyone soon.